students. This PowerPoint deals with teaching approaches, the principles to consider when choosing a teaching approach, and lastly, we're looking at the teacher-centered approach methods. Now, the teaching approaches refers to an overall set of principles, beliefs, or ideas about learning. They are, for example, a teacher-centered approach where the teacher is the guru in the classroom, and a learner-centered approach. The term method refers to a systematic and logical way of planning the steps or procedures of how to teach, namely how to apply the theories and approaches of learning in classroom situations. Teachers can, for example, use group work or role play as methods of teaching. So there's a difference between an approach. The approaches is the teacher-centered approach and a learner-centered approach. The methods are stuff like group work and role play. Therefore, the approach and method teacher uses determines the way in which the teaching situation will develop to achieve the objectives. The method selected should not only suit the teacher, but also the theme selected and the level of learners, but also the objectives to be achieved through the lesson. There is no ideal recipe that applies to all situations. A variety of methods are in fact implemented in a single lesson. A class discussion might introduce the lesson, an explanation by the teacher using the narrative method or the lecture method could form the middle phase, and the question and answer and textbook methods are suitable for the conclusion. Now, what are the principles to consider when choosing a method? Now, students, this is very important for your teaching as well as for your assessing this year. First off, the first principle is the principle of concretization. This relates subject matter to economic reality. Concrete, it is not abstract theory. Right? Then the concentric principle is where we say that teaching and learning should steadily grow in scope and in depth. For example, production is seen as a concrete process, but eventually it is viewed in a wider investment context. You know, when we throw a stone in the water, then it makes concentric circles on the water. In other words, it becomes bigger and bigger. Like the example of production that I've used now, you explain production, but eventually those products that came from production will end up being investments. Then we must also understand the principle of actuality. This is practical application of knowledge. For example, the workings of the JSE. Actual, how does it actually work? The immediate relevance of current economic issues should serve as a motivation for studies. Learners should be made to feel that gaining knowledge of the subject is worth the effort. Then the principle of stating the problem. We know that our textbooks are very descriptive. So as a teacher, we can't just work from the textbook as is and read from the textbook as is. We should transform the descriptive info in the textbook into problems. We should state problems. And that is another principle. Then the fifth principle is the principle of learner-centeredness. Here the focus is on the needs, skills, and interests of the learner. This is very topical. The CAPS document requires of us to be very conscious of learner-centeredness, because the learner is the focal point of the teaching and learning process. Then the sixth principle is the principle of critical thinking. Also, according to the CAPS document, teachers guide learners to think in deep, complex manner. Then learners need to conceptualize, apply, analyze, synthesize, and evaluate information to reach a conclusion. You can see this is higher order thinking, right? Critical thinking. Then another higher order principle is the principle of creativity. It forms part of the upper level of Bloom's taxonomy. New ideas are being created or invented. The principle of creativity. Then the principle of assessment for learning, you can see I've made it bold, and assessment of learning. The F stands for formative. While you are teaching, you are also assessing. So you use it as part of the learning process. And then the summative assessment part is the O part, assessment of learning. At the end of learning, we set an assessment of learners to assess what they have learned. The next principle that you must be aware of is the principle of credibility. The study undertaken must be trustworthy and withstand the scrutiny of fellow researchers and the research community, or the condition of being believable. The next principle is the principle of clear focus of intended objectives. Here, the subject content in each grade is prescribed by the curriculum. We must know what should be taught in each grade, right? And that is called the principle of clear focus of intended objectives. Then the principle of remedial teaching, that is to rectify or make good to learners who are struggling. And lastly, we have the principle of progression. This is the curriculum content progress from the basic to more complex between grades. In the curriculum, in the senior phase, must show progression from grade 9 to FET in grade 10. You need to have an overview of all 3 grades to determine at what level content must be dealt with in a particular grade. Now, these principles you must go through, read it with insight, because you are going to be assessed about it in assessment number 1. Now, the methods related to a teacher-centered approach. The first method is the lecture method. This is where the teacher is speaking and he is taking full responsibility for the progress of the lesson. The learners, here the teacher speaks to a whole class. Or sometimes if you are pressed for time, you can even have all the learners of a particular grade in the hall, and there you speak to all of them. So you are making use of the lecture method. The learners are expected to listen and think while the teacher informs, narrates. That is why this method is sometimes also called the narrative method. Expound or describe something, right? A lesson might proceed as follows. You have the analysis of the problem, the solution of the problem, and then the summary and application. Now, some of the requirements of the lecture method is that it should not be long. It should not be a reproduction of the textbook. It should have a beginning, a climax, and a conclusion. But it is also worthwhile to remember it's not only the words used by the teacher that are important, but also aspects such as tempo, emotional value, and body language. As I said before, this is a suitable method when you are pressed for time. I've used it quite a lot at school when we are pressed for time. Then what is the advantages of this method? It generates interest and breathes life into dry facts. It saves time. It supplements information when the textbook is inadequate, and so forth. The disadvantages, because you as the teacher are speaking alone and the learners are just listening, unless they are allowed to ask questions, but you will notice that if you want to speak alone, the learners don't mind that because it's less for them to do. So you must be aware of it. The disadvantage is that retention is not very high. The learner's ability to concentrate is limited. The teachers are apt to include too much information and there's no time for individual attention. Then, with this method and techniques that we can use to improve the lesson, try to involve the learner. Right? They learn better if they are interested, if they are being encouraged, and if they understand rather than memorize. Create opportunities where learners take down their own notes instead of the teacher's dictation. This forces learners to think and teachers to present well-structured subject matter. In that time, you can also rest you as the teacher while they're taking down their own notes. And you must also remember a good lecture never exhausts the subject matter. It introduces learners to resources for research. So learners are expected to research on their own after forming part of this lecture method. The next method is the discussion method. The discussion method, as the name implies, a discussion is taking place, especially between the learners. And this method came to the fore because it overcomes a lack of active involvement and lack of individual attention. The object is to involve as many learners as possible. The teacher is still the facilitator, but tries to remain in the background. In order to generate spontaneity and stimulate retention, the teacher should allow the learners to examine all relevant aspects and to find a solution to the problem. Apart from class discussion, there are also small group and panel discussions, brainstorming and debates. This all forms part of the discussion method. The requirements are an appropriate theme, full participation by the learners, and final feedback from the teachers. So the teachers must sum up what was being said at the end of it all. The advantage of the discussion method is that it encourages reading. Learners are made aware of other sources in addition to the textbook, right? Because the discussion method presupposes that the learners have read before they have come to class. If this method is not properly controlled, it can be disadvantageous in terms that it degenerates into aimless chatting. And also this method is time consuming, and sometimes little progress is made because people just talk in circles. Something that I left out here was the fifth bullet that deals with the type of discussions that we have. You can have policy discussions where learners adopt certain viewpoints. Problem-solving discussions where learners are seeking solutions to problems. Explanatory discussions where learners seek causes and effects, the causes of unemployment, and if you found the causes, what was the effects thereof. And then the feedback discussion. This, for example, is where learners give their impression after an excursion. The following method is the question and answer method. This method is understood to comprise a series of carefully selected questions. The ability to ask questions and deal correctly with the answers has long been regarded as one of the most important features of good teaching. There are two categories of questions: reproductive and productive, and you must know the difference between the two. With reproductive questions, the emphasis is on memorization. That is the accurate reproduction of what has been said. These questions require little intellectual activity. For example, list 5 items known as invisible exports. So learners can learn this type of answer off by heart, but that is considered rote learning and it should not be discouraged. Then what is productive questions? These questions require thought and present a challenge to the learners. They should also be able to apply knowledge, analyze material, and make decisions. An example of a productive question would be explain why a lack of productivity is a contributory cause of inflation. You can see that you can't study off by heart. You can study it off by heart later on. But first of all, you must think about the answer to such a question. Then questions have the following functions in the course of a lesson. Questions require thought and present a challenge to the learners. Right? The techniques that can be used to put questions, put the question to the entire group, allow learners time to think about it, and then ask someone to answer it. In other words, when you ask a question, you can't expect an answer immediately. Give about a 30 seconds window period for learners to think about it before you identify somebody to answer the question. If you see that they answer the question not fully, you can reformulate the question. With this method, it's important that you speak clearly enough to be audible to the entire group. 3 simple questions are preferable to 1 combined questions. Right? Divide your questions into 3 rather than all 3 in 1. The criteria for questions is you must ask yourself, is the question necessary? Beware asking too many rhetorical questions. That is why you must prepare when you use this method. Prepare yourself well. You can't just ask any question. It should have been worked out clearly. The formulations of questions should be unambiguous and grammatically correct. Questions should be meaningful, relevant, and relate to the subject content. And then how should learners' answers to questions be handled? You should remind learners to answer sentences in full. Acknowledge positive points, even if the whole answer is not correct. Do not interrupt while a learner is searching for words. Sometimes we want to take the words out of the learner's mouth and answer it ourselves. If necessary, repeat answers so that the whole class can hear. Do not encourage learners to answer in a chorus. That is happening quite regularly in class. Then very importantly, what I didn't put down here is that you should also encourage learners to ask questions to you. In other words, you should exchange the role with the learners. The next method is the textbook method. Now you might think, what is this method doing here? Isn't it old-fashioned? No, the textbook remains one of the most important aids in the classroom. All right? It offers a measure of security to both learners and especially inexperienced teachers. But remember, you do not work from the textbook, you work from the KEBS document. But the info that you use to cover what is in the KEBS document comes from the textbook, but you should not only have 1 textbook, but more than 1 textbook. All right? Then for the textbook method, you should look at how it should be used. Sometimes the teacher reads from the textbook. During discussion of a theme, the teacher can read short sections from the textbook or ask one of the learners to do so. This draws the learner's attention to certain aspects of the subject matter and can be of great value. The teacher discusses the contents and the learner studies the textbook at home. All learners have to study the textbook beforehand. Or the teacher explains the subject matter and provides a blackboard or whiteboard scheme. The textbook has the following advantages. It offers the teacher a point of departure. It provides a basis for assignments and discussions. Then a very important aspect is the selection of the textbook and various factors that you must consider when selecting. For example, as the education department approve the book, is the author a subject specialist or an educationalist? The date of publication, has the book been reprinted? The appearance of the textbook, is it of high quality? Does the book cover the syllabus? Because I can assure you, some topics are not clearly covered in a textbook. If the author doesn't know much about the topic, he just writes 1 or 2 sentences, but then the CAPS document requires much more than that. The language of the textbook, is it readable? Will it be readily understandable by learners? Does the book contain assignments, exercises, and questions to get the learners involved? This helps with formative assessment. Are the illustrations complete, clear, and illuminating? Does the book include examples of test papers? And then is the price competitive? The last method that we need to look at under the teacher-centered approach is the use of economic cartoons as a study method. Now, these are drawings or pictures of current topical issues such as poverty, unemployment, or the after effects of COVID-19 on the world economy. These cartoons can draw learners' attention to an issue and make them open up to it. Van Wyk, 2011, suggests that the humor of cartoons serves to illustrate, reinforce, and make more comprehensible the material being taught. Read up on cartoons as a teaching tool in Van Wyk and Dos Roy's. That is your recommended textbook. One of the questions in assignment 2 is dealing with cartoons, as this is often used in economic question papers at school. You can go through, when you get to a school, look through, ask the economics teacher for his file on old question papers, and you will find that one of the questions must be a question on cartoons. So it is important that you understand it, that you become okay with it. And that article on Van Wyk and Dos Roy's can give you some guidance on the use of cartoons. That, ladies and gentlemen, concludes this section on teaching approaches and methods, the principles involved when selecting a method, and the different teacher-centered methods. I thank you.